Yeah, things working. Yeah. Okay, cool. We can go. Okay. Tiaan, I've been very excited for this conversation, but I think the best will be is if you just introduce yourself, what you
Cool.
do, because it is the business, bucks and beach bats. So basically, tell us about your business, tell us who you are, what you do, man.
Yeah, so thanks for the opportunity to be here. I mean, I'm also excited. Um, I
Good.
think so. As my name's Tiaan Fourie, I'm the founder of Responsible Capital. Um, I've been in the financial services industry for just on 25 years this year. I started my career in September 1998, and I've worked in various roles in various organizations across the spectrum of investments, dealing, let's call it from when I started my career as a call center agent. It
Wow.
was literally the week after the emerging market crisis in South Africa, and our stock market lost like 35% in that month, in the previous month of August,
Wow.
1998.
Was
And
that the .com, .com?
it was actually so actually related to there's a thing called LTCM, which is at that stage one of the largest financial defaults in the world, which was a hedge fund
Oh,
that bet
right.
on emerging market fixed income debt arbitrage strategies. Okay, and the
Right.
thing blew. And it was an
Okay.
illiquidity story, So it wasn't actually they had really good strategies that was very sound, but they basically got squeezed by their providers of their shorts, So and eventually the thing blew up. But it created that was, we often, and this is the great thing about the financial markets, okay, is narrative. That's what
Yeah.
sells is a narrative. So
Yeah.
everyone in the market remembers LTCM. What's also interesting is around about the same time, you also had the Asian tiger debt default. Basically the entire hub of Asia today that people consider bulletproof, like Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea, basically
Mm.
went to shit. Okay, in
Wow.
seconds, just about. Their debt, they defaulted on American debt, and the economies really struggled, and it was a massive crisis across the world. It spilled into Russia. The Russians started defaulting on their debt again. It was just chaos, and South Africa was caught in the midst of that. And
Wow.
the
How?
reason, well, so obviously we're also an emerging market, So when people in developed markets become risk averse, they don't just go and say, things are really cuck in Asia, I'm going to reduce my risk there. They just say, listen, I'm indiscriminately selling everything and just putting it in cash in many cases. Because it also actually impacted the American market, especially when LTCM went, because then there was like contagion. But what was fascinating to me is I arrived there, this, 19-year-old, I had just, come back from America when I was actually 20. I
Okay.
went to the States to play basketball, actually. So
What?
I got a
Really?
scholarship to play
Okay.
basketball. Yeah, I'm a little bit bigger than most. I'm a little bit bigger than
How
most, and
tall are
it's
you?
obviously 6'10", so 209. Put it this way, I'm
Wow.
bigger than any Springbok that's ever played for South Africa. I think there's one guy. So Andries Bakker is two. He was 208. And
Wow. That's
but other
cool.
than him, I think there was one guy at one stage that was I don't think he played Springbok, but I don't know. Yeah.
Now,
So
90s
anyways,
basketball was huge, man. In South Africa, that's when people were playing.
yeah, I mean, so it's just before the professional league went up and stole all the money. So it was like really, it was a
The
booming. It was the
professional
fastest
league in
growing
South
sport in our
Africa.
country. Yeah, we had the PBA,
Yes,
and
I
the
know. I went to
owners ended
games
up
in
some.
Pretoria. There was the Pretoria Bulls. There was a
Yeah,
Joburg team.
yes, exactly. It was the Igoli Magic
Yes,
was
that's
playing
it.
out of Joburg. Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yes. And you had the
Watching that.
Natal Tuskers, and you had the whole. So my brother actually played a bit of local ball. But I mean, so
Wow.
for me, So going to America was like a dream. I thought to myself,
And
shit,
that's
it's
where you
going to be.
studied.
I'm going to the land of. So I
Mm.
went there with the idea to go and study and play basketball. Originally, actually, before I got there, my original thinking was I wanted to study genetics. I was very interested
Yeah.
in genetics in high school
Amazing.
and started getting involved in that. And I actually, I remember as a 12-year-old, my mother bought me a subscription to Time magazine as a birthday present in 1991. And one of the articles in there was on genetics, on the genome. And I decided to contact the author, and he was some doctor at MIT at that stage.
Okay.
And yeah, so I got in touch with him, and we started engaging with each other. And he sent me some, my dad had a fax machine, so we could get these rolling pieces of paper with and he sent me all interesting stuff. So it always tickled my fancy. And in the end, I decided that I wanted to go to America to go study genetics. And then, quickly realized that the cost implications of that going to a place like, because the idea would have been to go to MIT.
Yeah, so you needed a scholarship.
But you don't, you don't really qualify. So you have corporate sponsors normally get involved. Okay, so for a South African guy to get a corporate sponsor in the US was quite unlikely, So, and there was very few South African companies that was keen to send me over to go and study genetics, So that I quickly realized that was probably
could be enough.
So now this is the point. So I started recognizing the fact that perhaps sports not really, massive on the list at MIT. They don't really encourage the guys there to get involved in curricular activities. The idea there is a bit more focused on other areas. So I recognized that perhaps my skill set could be applied elsewhere, and had a conversation with my agent, and she ended up knowing some coach in a couple of interesting places, smaller places, and I was like, sounds great. And what actually ended up happening was, she started going through the possible places, and I was like, okay, there's one requirement here. I come from Africa, so the sun needs to shine where I am. So please, so I ended up, after a bit of trial and error, I ended up in Arizona, which is spectacular. I went to Phoenix.
The Phoenix Suns.
And of course, so that would have been the professional team. And what was interesting is our coach, one of our players, he was the first Mexican professional basketball player in the NBA, a guy called Horacio Lamas, and he played for the Phoenix Suns. So we had so it was a fascinating, so that was an interesting part of my life, but also very short, because what actually ended up happening was, as a South African man, I had developed quite a tendency to party too much as a youngster, so anyway, I think it's a cultural disposition that, plagues many South Africans. And anyway, so and going to the States, which was actually, fascinating to me, coming from, I came from rural South Africa. I grew up in Pietersburg, racist central in many cases. And so talking about, complete dichotomy for me as a human being, playing basketball in most cases. My dad was like, why are you playing this sport? There's like, we've got to go to places like Attridgeville and Wembley Stadium. Are you crazy? What am I doing here? The first time I went to play a tournament at Wits, my dad was like, this is not my game. So it was interesting. So I arrived there, and I had this perception that America is going to be the land of the free, free thinking people without constraints. And I experienced the exact opposite. You had these ignorant, racist, narrow-minded country folk almost. They had that mentality. And it was like, and initially, okay, I went to a Baptist university. So let's start there, But what was interesting is, you would expect people to be a little bit more open-minded, especially because the guys I was hanging with was the basketball players. They didn't. There was, I think, at the stage I was there, we were like 900 students in the university.
The whole university.
And what was fascinating, whole university. Well, no. So they had a. It was just like a startup Christian university. Right. It's currently now actually the largest university in the United States, which is fascinating. So their market shifted a little bit, not a lot, but anyway, it's called Grand Canyon University. Okay. And what was interesting is a lot of the players that we were with, they were either guys that were they weren't locals, and that the bulk of them came from California and other places. And they, I think, out of the 15 players that we had on the team, about 6 of them were Division I dropouts. So what happens is you get a problem, your grades drop or something happens and you can't play Division I basketball anymore. We were a Division II school. So a lot of those guys ended up playing for us. But we were ranked, probably in the top 100 universities at that stage with basketball because our coach was really good. So anyway, it was a brilliant experience. But as I try to allude to, I had developed this tendency to enjoy life. And as an underage South African in a foreign country, it wasn't always appreciated. So, in the end, my tenure in the United States was a little bit shorter than anticipated, and I came back after my first year after having lost my scholarship. But anyway, it was so it was a little bit disappointing. But anyway, as I said, it launched my career in financial services, which was, looking back at it today, the other thing that it actually did for me, and that's actually why I started the story there, because I probably could have skipped that part. But what was interesting is I went to the States with this illusion that I'm going to the greatest country on earth. I really did. I was convinced. I mean, because I was a basketball player. I loved American sport. Fuck, I was a grunge man. I mean, yet this was the era of America, man. And, it was the .com site. It was just like heyday kind of vibes, So I was actually in the US in 97, 98 as this, euphoria was, using internet for the first time. And it was like, what is this? It's like, I can send messages across the world. It was like ridiculous. Yahoo, And it was interesting to be there. But what I realized within the first couple of weeks of arriving was just how, we have this image of the United States, but the reality is completely different. And what I had realized, having just been through the whole transition of apartheid to democracy, having living in a country that asked some really tough questions of ourselves, I was like, but, we are so far ahead of these people. It's an insult to me that I consider this the greatest country on earth, because I just recognized I had left the greatest country on earth. And it was because of our people, And so the reason I started the story there is I went with this idea in my mind that I'm going to go to the US, become a famous basketball player, and that's my route. And you know what? That it wasn't, because I had recognized that I have a responsibility to actually come and live my life here. And so I came back in 98, a little bit depressed initially, because they actually, my coach phoned me back, and one of our other teammates ended up having issues with his grades. Because the one thing, I never had issues with grades, because that's the other thing I found fascinating. The standard in American college was atrocious. I remember going to my first algebra class, and so it's like you have to do like general math and stuff to get people onto the same level. In the first 2 years. Well, that's what the program was like. I don't know if it shifted. So, but what I found fascinating, the stuff that I was learning in varsity was standard 7 high grade math. And I was like, I'm not going to spend all this money and I'm going to repeat high school. So I did some more difficult classes, because you can obviously do more difficult stuff. But it was just interesting to see that the standard, again, of their education system is significantly lower than ours.
Especially thought going there that it was great.
Exactly, because that was the impression that was created, especially at things like math and science, But again, I presume that it would have shifted if I stayed longer. So let's just assume it's a bridging the gap kind of scenario. But what was fascinating to me is then having that realization. Initially I came here, I was a bit depressed that because I recognized the opportunity that I had thrown away. And then to make matters worse, as I was about to embark on my new career in investment services or financial services, I get a phone call from my coach saying, "Listen here, dude, if you can make this work, we've spoken to the admin. We'll find a way to get it sorted. But there's 1 or 2 things that needs to happen, and you know what? We'll give you a free ride for 4 years if you can come back." Because my other teammate because I was tall, they recruit people in pairs normally. There was 2 of us that were the tall guys, and the other guy was a little bit older than me.
Power forwards.
Centers. We were both centers. I would play mainly center. He would play power forward and center. So what was interesting, because I was not as mobile as a lot of these guys. I was a bit of an overweight rugby player.
You had the height, but you didn't have the agility.
Yeah, and also it's I think about it. I remember my coach always laughing. She's like, "This African has never even bounced the leather ball, and now he's playing basketball." He goes, "What are you guys doing?" He often joked. He mocked the guys, but it wasn't. A center doesn't need to bounce the ball, as an example. But he always said to me, "Don't bounce the ball."
I'm not as tall as you, but school basketball, I played center.
Okay.
And you don't have the skill. You just got to be in the paint. You just got to get the
space. Exactly. That's what they teach you: dominate the space. And fortunately, as a rugby player,
big guy as well, so I'm just knocking guys out. That's my job.
Exactly. Exactly. And I remember one of the funniest stories in playing basketball was, I remember I broke my nose in a game, and so I got an elbow in the nose early. Yes, and I was earmarked to what they call it red shirt. So what happens is you actually don't play in the league games, They only let you play in the invitational games because then you still have 4 years of eligibility left. So we had like a 5-year plan of me staying there playing basketball. That was the original thinking.
Right.
So anyway, and I remember I broke my nose and my nose started bleeding. So in those days, obviously, I used to shave my head. And I had this, and I always swore on Afrikaans when I played. So I had these like moments, these fits of rage on the court, and people would be like, and it's like, and they called me the Great Dragon, the head of the Ku Klux Klan at one stage. And it's like, and then I'm with all these, basketball players. So it was quite funny. And no one believed that I was from Africa because they're like, there's no white people in Africa. What are you talking about? Literally.
You're the only
even
African
guys told me that. There's like, most, you can't be from Africa. You sound like an American because I speak with this like funny American accent. But anyway.
Yeah.
And I remember, and I broke my nose, and they said to me, I must come down, they clean me up, and you're not allowed to play with blood and anything. It's like the mid-90s, AIDS paranoia or HIV paranoia. And what was fascinating, one of our other players hurt his ankle and he wanted to get off, and because they're trying to save the guys for the league games. I'm like, no, but I'll go back. And they're like, no, but you can't because you're going to bleed. I'm like, no, I won't bleed on me. They're like, what do you mean? I said, no, I'll drink my blood. So I go back on the court and they clean me up. The hope is that I don't get a knock on my nose because as soon as you get a knock on your nose, it starts bleeding again. So like the first rebound I go up for, the guy hits me flat bang on the nose and then blood just starts running down my face. And what I do is I open my mouth and I start drinking my own blood. So, because I don't want to go off the court now, I'm just back on again, I start drinking my own blood, and these people, like literally, the guys almost get afraid of me while I'm on the court, and then I shout in this funny language, and it's like they were literally afraid of me. So
oh my God,
yeah, exactly. But in the end, as I said, I found my place in financial services in South Africa, which was a fascinating environment because now I arrive and my sister was working in one of the large life insurers and she knew someone and they said, I can come for an interview. So I was at Momentum. So I started my career at Momentum. She was working there and I arrived there, and the first thing they do is they make you write a little test, So I arrived in, because they had this policy at Momentum that only, employ people with qualifications and they want to go for the brightest of the bright and, building out this quality team. And, so I didn't really stand a chance, but it sounded like, the shit was hitting the fan and they had a bit of desperation. So timing might have been perfect. So anyway, what actually ends up happening is I was earmarked to be a call center agent. So the idea would be is, you'd sit with headphones on and you'll deal with stuff. But because we had just experienced this emerging market crisis and, things were going a bit hectic, there was lots of turmoil in their administration business. So what actually ended up happening was I write this little, as the entry thing, you write like a math and a language proficient test.
Right.
And I actually end up doing quite well in the math test. So they're like, hang on, this guy can count. So the next thing they ask me is, can you use a computer? I'm like, yeah, I've just used email. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
I'm like a email.
Maybe.
They're like, okay, so you understand? I'm like, no. I've just used email. They're like, okay, so you don't. So what ends up happening is I go to this like a certain team within their business that does, math. We have to fix errors, So obviously at that stage, there's lots of things happening and lots of errors occurring, finger errors, people processing stuff late. There was just like lots of work. So I ended up working in this really cool division where I learned math. So I've always had a tendency for math, but I never knew. I remember my first couple of calculations I did by hand. Because the woman said to me, I've got to give her an Excel spreadsheet, and I couldn't because I didn't know how to Excel, how Excel worked. So I actually did it by hand in like tables, and I would have these like scribbling tables and calculators in my head that I could do, so I could give them the calculations. And she'd be like, "But why didn't you just do it in Excel?" I'm like, "It takes me longer." She's like, "No. It's only going to take you long the first time, and then you have a spreadsheet." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" She's like, "No. You can build in formulas." I'm like, "That just sounds ridiculous, man. I can do it on paper." She's like, "No. Trust me." So, okay, eventually it taught me how to use Excel, which changed my life in many ways.
Changed your life forever.
Exactly. You see, I mean, and I'll be honest, relative to some people, I look like a complete idiot using Excel because, I've seen some of my peers do some amazing stuff in it, but it's never really tickled my fancy. But anyway, I managed to deal with some really interesting outcomes in financial services quite early, like identifying errors, and working with, how a money market prices or how an offshore fund works. And, why did certain managers in those days, people like Alan Gray, and there were a couple of like outliers that did exceptionally well while the others was being blown to shreds, So I started engaging with the market in quite an interesting way. And I mean, I was privileged that I moved from, again, big organizations. There's a lot of opportunities if you're willing to embrace them. So I ended up moving around, and I got to an investment focused division within Momentum. And I was privileged. I had a mentor there, he was one of the more creative actuaries that you'll ever meet, and an amazing guy. His name's Rian van Dijk.
Okay.
So anyway, and I mean, he was one of the few people that accepted my eccentricities. So for him, it was okay that I arrived with my ripped jeans at work. He didn't lambast me too much for it.
This is at Momentum, right?
So he was the then CEO of their multi-manager division or something.
Right.
I think it was called Momentum Advisory Services at that stage. Okay. And as I said, that again exposed me to some really interesting stuff. So long story short, I ended up migrating into a specialist investment role in 2000. Okay. So again, interesting time to be alive, and being exposed to the markets because,
Yeah, but at this point, you don't have an investment degree or anything like that. You're learning directly at the life insurance company.
On the fly, And right. I mean, they were always interested in trying to encourage you to do that. So I explored the idea of doing. They were willing to pay for a thing called Tuks na 5, So you can go to Tukkies and get your degree after 5 in the afternoons,
Tuks of niks.
Tuks of niks. But the reason I did it was I was in Centurion. So my brother was studying at Tuks. I had some friends that were studying at Tuks. My girlfriend was at Tuks. So it made sense to me to do Tuks na 5, And online wasn't that big in those days, So, and I'll be honest with you, being a 20-year-old, back in South Africa, earning a bit of a salary for the first time in your life, skipping the bar and going to Tuks na 5 wasn't in my journey. Let's call it that. Yeah. I tried it for a year and then I realized, I'm going to waste my Brandewyn money here. So I ended up falling over to the dark side again. But anyway.
While you were in Centurion.
Exactly. We say that. In those days, I mean, this is the other thing. Living in the financial services industry at that stage was an interesting life, because it was pre-RDR, the fee scales were quite different.
Phase isn't even in
place. The budgets were different.
License to sell. You don't have to have education, or you maybe a matric they wanted, but it's
so again, I think what was interesting to me again as a let's call it a person that took the road less traveled into financial services, So I remember now as a young man being exposed to highly intellectual, highly intelligent, people with lots of 3-letter qualifications behind their names, after or befront, pick one, lots of these things, highly intelligent guys. And then I realized half of them are, inept to manage money. Okay. More than half. Okay. They were so the degree doesn't allow you the insight to handle challenging circumstances,
Mm-hmm.
And, even I remember, and that was the other benefit in those days, we had the privilege that we could engage directly with some of the most intelligent guys I've met in my life. Okay. Literally, I could phone him up and have a conversation with him. And it was because, a company like Alan Gray was a great example. It was, they had their process made people think about things very differently. So most of the junior analysts, portfolio managers that went through Alan Gray in the 90s, all became some kind of investment legend or version of that in the next 20 years. All of them, every single one. Okay. Yeah. I can't think of one high-ranking Alan Gray guy that hasn't had a lasting impact on the industry. Okay.
Right.
In some way or form.
And
either
gone
through
on
legacy.
To do other great things internationally.
Exactly. Yeah. Many of them going on further into the international business or setting up their own stuff. And there are some outliers and special examples, but a lot, even the guys that stay there. I mean, one of the guys that I really rate in our industry is a guy called Sandy McGregor. I think Sandy McGregor was around, when Moses lived. I'm not convinced, but I'm sure he was around, And And, he's one of the most insightful economists you'll meet in your life because he's not really an economist either. He doesn't see himself as an economist, but he studied economics. And, he's a fascinating. So there's some guys that even stayed with Alan Gray that have also, really had an enormous impact. And so I had a lot of respect, but we had the benefit. We could actually literally phone these guys up and have a conversation with them. We played golf with them. I even had the privilege to go to Bermuda, and I actually went to their international business, and I sat with some of the international guys, and this is the kind of access we had in those days. Okay. So as an uneducated person in theory, so I had no degree, I had my high school, but I could think on my feet, and I was reasonably analytic. So there's certain portions of asset management that really resonated with me. But I always felt a little bit, inferior because I didn't have a degree, in spite of the insights that I had. So, and that plagued me for a long time in my career, where I think I had a point to prove. So eventually in 2013, one of my, colleagues then said to me, listen, I really think you need to do the CFA. You have all the expertise to do it, just do it.
But you need
I was like, okay, cool. And it's like, initially you need an undergrad, or you need more than, I think it's 5 years experience or something. So ended up, because I qualified through experience, I ended up doing my CFA in 2013. And I must be honest with you, it was one of the more challenging things I had to do in my life, especially considering over the same time I got engaged, married, and had 2 children.
Sure.
In that span, of 5 years of getting my CFA, and also failed it twice. Failed the second leg twice.
Yeah, you've got the CFA 1, 2, and 3.
Exactly. So the second one,
CFA, yeah.
But then it depends on your work experience. You get your charter if you qualify after, I think it's also 5 years work experience. But most guys would tend to, once they get the CFA, they tend to have the 5 years because I think what's also interesting is they're also connecting it to the master's and honors program of a lot of the universities today.
Sure.
So and again, I'll be honest, I learned an enormous amount from the CFA, but the bulk of it relates to how not to make investment decisions, which, I think would surprise most people. But it also showed me how many other people think about the world. Okay. And why, obviously my views can be quite controversial and quite different to many. Okay. And that's one of the reasons why we're having this conversation. So I recognized the CFA actually taught me a lot about myself. Okay. And eventually it got to a point where, I think it meant a lot more to other people that I had my CFA, because it felt to them, it gave more credence to my views or how I was doing things, where I didn't really experience it that way.
So they knew you had it. They knew you were good, but they were probably needing to explain and to be able to market to clients. The guy has a CFA. He must know what the fuck he's doing.
You see, but that's the misnomer. I mean, as I said, I think there's now 250,000 CFAs in the world. Okay. It's, it's the same concept. I think, how many truly original people exist in the world? It's probably a much lower percentage than we think. Okay. And that's consistent across all spectrums. And I don't think a degree or and even includes master's, doctorate qualification kind of vibe, increases your capacity to have original thoughts. Okay. I really don't. And I think that's why sometimes they find these math geniuses in the middle of nowhere in the Himalayas or in the Amazon, because they just looked at things differently their whole lives, and it works. So, I'm a big fan of accountability. Okay. I'm a big fan of exploring win-win situations. And I think the challenge we had in the old days in the financial service industry and it's a challenge that's persisted because it's part of the DNA of the system, is it tends to be self-serving. Okay. And I remember having this conversation once with a product developer, and it was done in a bit of jest. We were at some function, probably
developing a financial service product to package it or what?
Yeah. So we were at a function. We were at a sponsored event by one of the product providers, and I'm not going to name a name. And I remember having this conversation with one of their asset managers, and I was like, and the guy said it in jest. He said to me, But again, it wasn't. It was actually endemic and indicative of how we view this. He made the comment and he said, you know what, when we design a product, the benefit to the client is purely coincidental. And it's actually true. Okay. It's actually true. So when you think about it, and we often see it, most product providers serve their shareholders. That's who they serve. They serve their shareholders and the management teams first, because that's how the incentives are aligned. Okay.
Yeah.
And once they've done that, only after that has occurred, then the product, the what do you call it? The client gets his return. Okay. And that's how, I mean, there are many examples in our country today where you can go look at, you mentioned earlier your friend looking at that 5-year underperformance from a given fund relative to a benchmark. Now, again, there is some subjectivity in that. And again, I don't necessarily measure things on that basis because there is complexity and it requires more context. Okay. But that's an example. But
context is everything for me. Let's get the context here.
Exactly. So what's interesting is I remember, one of the largest life insurers in our country, well-known brand, they do all kinds of stuff. There's always been this joke in the industry, never buy a policy from them, but you can buy the share. You can invest in the business, but you don't want to be a policy holder. You know why? You know exactly what it is.
One of the oldest ones. The one of the oldest ones. The blue one, not the red one. I mean,
there's more than one blue one, dude. There's more than one blue one. You see, this is the challenge. There's always been more. So again, it's what's interesting is again, I look at that and it's endemic. How is that possible? And the reason for it is quite simple. We've taken this complexity that the market is, and let's not change this. The market is complex. It's a complex ecosystem, and this is the thing that sometimes, especially as an investment professional that has dedicated I'm passionate about investments, and it's something that is ingrained in how I see the world, And I sometimes get frustrated where there's other people that might be around for 20 years, and they specialize in other areas. To then start making claims like I do this for a living, I'm like, dude, analyzing data and giving advice is it's two very, very different things, And again, and I think, we also saw that in something like COVID, So one of the most fascinating experiences for me during COVID was, there's just the general collapse of critical thinking. And it relates to fear, I remember experiencing it in investment markets too, when the shit hits the fan, most people don't have the capacity to think. They just go with the crowd because there's safety in numbers, That's an inherent genetic disposition that we face as human beings. And the few that managed to stand up were the ones that really, stood out from the crowd into the future. And I think, COVID was a similar example of that. People that managed to apply critical thought managed to come out much less unscathed than others. But one of the things that was very clear, and I mean, it gave birth to an organization like Panda. And I don't know if you follow Panda at all, but if you don't, you need to.
I don't actually. Explain Panda?
So Panda, I'm not sure. It's probably a business that's been around for a long time because I think the actuaries now. The one thing that you must know, I'm not a fan of actuaries. So for me to embrace actuarial information was difficult from the get-go. But what was interesting about these guys, what they did was, and they were one of the first, if not the first, to identify data anomalies. Okay, so that's all they did. They looked at the data that was being presented, and they basically used, complex theory to do and modeling to model the outcomes that were being given based on the data flow. And what they found is, when there is normal distribution on things, patterns emerge in data. So when you have outliers to that, you need to ask questions, okay? Because then the data doesn't appear, it appears fabricated. And that's what they were saying. They were saying this in...
You've been good at finding mistakes, so that's why you like it. That's why you started.
But it's also about, going against the herd, because a lot of the narratives that they were presenting was saying, hang on, we think it's this, but perhaps it's not. The data is not confirming this. And the data that they are providing seems a bit stretched, okay? And they didn't out and out say the guys are lying. And eventually, they did an analysis. And I want to say, I think it was in June 2020, they published their first paper where effectively they were saying that, listen here, mortality is being overestimated dramatically in the numbers because we have many false positives, okay? And they were and they didn't base it on medical data. They were saying it's based on the data that we see, the information that's being provided. It's not consistent. We need to ask better questions. And eventually, what was fascinating to me, their theory that they presented in, I think it was June 2020. This is now, you're talking 4 months into the equation, okay? 4 months into the fucking madness. These guys came up with a solution. They said, I'm talking COVID. It's 4 months into the COVID crisis. They came up with a solution. And they said, question everything. Nothing is true, okay? And that was confirmed by Johns Hopkins in 2021, December 2021. They effectively confirmed because Panda shared the data on an open source basis with anyone and said, listen, this is the data we have. Okay.
Yeah.
In June of 2020, I want to think. Yeah. So for me, what I felt is by thinking about the world originally and asking good questions, we can get better outcomes. Okay. And I've spent my career on trying to do that. Almost acting, not contrary to the crowd, but independent of the crowd. Because sometimes, this is the thing, I love swarm theory. I don't know if you've ever, interesting field to go into, this idea where they analyze the bird swales that fly, okay, and how the swarm finds the most efficient way to fly, okay? So, and I think so at times, the swarm knows where to go. But what we forget in swarm theory is there is collateral damage. So there are, the outliers basically die. So there is creative destruction that occurs. Now, for me, that's the opportunity, okay? So, because the one thing that I find fascinating, we look at the world, and the recent debacles that we've been through and the let's call it the manias that has been around the last couple of years have been enormous, and all the clever people with degrees and CFAs and stuff will try and come up with rationales on why this transpired. And you know what? They come up with 50 plausible reasons. But why it happened remains very simple. It's because humans were involved, okay? And this is the one consistent factor that we as financial services professionals denounce, okay? Because we want to focus on the data, the cold stuff, focus on the earnings. If you know the earnings, you know where the company's going. That's bullshit, man. It's not true. The empirical data does not support that. And the reason for it is quite simple, because the earnings is not the only determinant of the success of the company, okay? Yeah. It's the PE of that company that probably plays the most important role. And that's why, things like Tesla persist much longer than people think, because people are always pessimistic on the earnings, but people don't recognize the emotional connotation that people have to the price. Because some people just love the share. They want to be part of it and they're willing to pay anything for it.
PE, excuse my ignorance, it's price to earnings ratio, right?
Yeah. So what that effectively, so the PE effectively measures the rating that investors put on the cash flow of a given company. That's the, let's call it rough theory of it. So, and that's why some companies trade at a PE of 20, Naspers trades at a PE of, 40, 35, whatever it is. It's a high PE, okay? So some stocks have high PEs and investors are comfortable paying high PEs for those stocks, okay?
Right.
Other stocks, and this is the interesting thing, sometimes that same stock that now has a 35 PE has a PE of 5 or 6 or 7 because people hate it. So then, well, no, low is not necessarily. Low can be a cheap entry point for you to purchase. Does that make sense? So it means it highlights that there is a anomaly, okay? So what is interesting, and you've seen, that's where the concept of value and growth stocks come from. So that's a very rudimentary and simple way to look at it, Growth stocks tend to have high P's and value stocks tend to have low P's. That's not always true because sometimes, a really expensive stock can have a really high PE because they're on inflated earnings. So a good example would be, sometimes oil companies, when the oil price is $150 a barrel, they're making so much money, it's ridiculous.
The earnings are good.
The earnings is exceptionally high. So regardless of what the price action is, the PE actually stays quite low. So sometimes, but then the earnings disappears. So then when the earnings disappear, when the price of oil drops from 135 to minus 27, all of a sudden, as an oil company, you make less money, So your price needs to adjust for the new earnings base. So it doesn't matter that your rating might have only been 5 or 10 times. Your earnings go from 100 to 10. So it doesn't matter what the multiplier is, it's a problem, okay? So that's, again, other challenges. It's not as simple as just buying low PE or high PE stocks. And I think, but this is the interesting thing. I started looking at that because I had the privilege of speaking to someone like Simon Marais for many years. Simon was he was the CIO at Alan Gray for, in their,
Okay.
let's call it their recovery heyday, and he was a nuclear physicist. He was an interesting person, a really fascinating guy. And he resonated with me because he was like 6'7". He's a tall guy.
Did he play basketball though?
He didn't. No, we laughed about that. He also had really big hands, So Simon was an interesting guy, but he was a soft-spoken guy, and I loved that about him, But it was because he was really off the charts intelligent, And I remember one of his greatest gifts was he took really complex things and make them sound really simple. Okay. And there was lots of stuff happening in his mind to make that happen, but it was fascinating to converse with him. And he had this ability with so much authenticity to convey a message that it resonated with so many people, regardless of your experience level. So you could have been, highly intelligent, analytical, he would resonate with you, or you could be a pleb from the street and he would resonate with you. He was a fascinating guy. Yeah. Simon passed away a couple of years ago. But I mean, I had the privilege of dealing with him. Now, he was a deep value guy. He was one of those people that was fanatical about valuation,
Which Alan Gray that's one of the philosophies.
Well, I mean, Alan Gray, is a chameleon. They've been a chameleon their lives, okay? Where they became famous as a value manager, okay? But they're not a value manager. Okay, and this is, interesting enough, I recently saw an article, I think it was written by one of the DFMs, I can't remember who, and I don't want to make a mistake of giving credit to the wrong party, so I'm not going to say, I think it was Morningstar, but I mean, it doesn't really matter, perhaps someone can comment on it, but they wrote an article on how Alan Gray isn't value anymore. Okay, now, as I said, or actually related to their offshore business, which is Orbis, okay? And what's fascinating to me is, having been one of the earlier investors in Orbis in the late 90s, I have a very long-standing relationship with them, utmost respect for the business. But what is interesting is I remember during the mid-2000s, one of the biggest conversations that was happening at that stage is, will value persist into the future? And Orbis was like, no, value does not persist into the future. As a strategy, Orbis's view was you have to shift over time. They did not believe in having a blind focus on one approach. And Alan Gray is actually similar to that, And Alan Gray, if you look at Alan Gray, what Alan Gray was 25 years ago, not even going back 50, because I think it's their 50th anniversary this year. If I go back 25 years, the business today is completely different to what it was 25 years ago. Okay. Sure. And again, they've morphed from a client-focused investment boutique into one of the most iconic investment brands in our country.
Yeah, but that's only been over the last, say, 10, 15 years, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe.
100%. Yeah, so they used to be, I remember when I invested with Alan Gray in the late 90s, they were a non-known retail brand. They had launched their retail unit trust in, I want to say, September 1998. Perfect timing. Okay, so they launched literally at the bottom of the market, and from that point onwards, they outperformed consistently. Everyone. Yeah. And what's interesting, though, is they went from a small boutique investment manager managing under 10 billion rand, which in those days was already a lot of money, but it was the asset base had dropped by something like 65% between 1994 and 1998, or 1996 and 1998, because they were not part of the growth crowd. They were very much valuation focused and they underperformed. But anyway, they got rewarded for that. And then what was interesting is, and this is the fascinating thing about Alan Gray, I was privileged enough to be quite close to the business because I knew the marketing guys quite well, I was this outspoken, loud, fun guy to be around at many of these functions, and I was young. So I got invited to many of the functions. Lots of fun, And what was interesting is Alan Gray made the decision in August 2001 to enter the retail market heavily. They decided that they've got an institutional presence. They now need to build a retail presence. And initially, they were quite skeptical about it. And then they found some really creative marketing guys on their side, and it was structurally in the business, And I remember, I think their first 2 marketing appointments at Alan Gray, one of the guys is still there, and he's one of my best friends. And, so I've been involved in the business for a long time, and I have a lot of respect for them. But what is interesting, having this discussion around, is Alan Gray value? The answer is they're not, okay? Yeah. And they were value, and that's what made them famous, but it's a more complex business than that. And again, they've become an investment brand that support their clients well, okay? And as much as I have some frustrations with organizations like Alan Gray on various other levels, and I try and engage with them on that, because I think as an industry, we line ourselves up for disappointing our customers because we're not managing their expectations correctly. We create expectations on, look, this is my 50-year track record. Look how well I've done. Knowing full well that you can't repeat that. Okay, so why then market that? So I struggle with that kind of approach. And, so that's, again, we need to keep questioning the narrative. So even when someone presents you a 50-year track record about how good they are, ask many questions. Okay, sure. I'm not saying they're not skilled, but you have to start asking questions for it, because probability is quite high. They're marketing you the 50-year track record because they're trying to gain credibility with you as a stable long-term option. Okay.
Yeah.
Does that mean they're necessarily going to be the best option for you in the next 5 years? I doubt it. Empirical data is not supportive of that. I'm a big fan of, exploring narratives and then finding ways to align with the customer. And that's the goal. So
So tell me, just to round it up a little bit here, so you still do investments, you run responsible capital. Is that, does it actually run funds? Does it run consulting for other funds? And what does it actually do, responsible capital?
So I'll be honest, I went through a soul-searching exercise, as I think many did during COVID. And I recognize that certain parts of the industry really resonate with me.
Okay.
Certain parts I find extremely nauseating. Okay. And because of that, I then, life also happened. And it ended up that I was retrenched in October 2020.
Where were you working?
So I had a relation. I was working at a boutique multi-manager in Johannesburg, had a long-standing relationship with the guys. We'd known each other 20 plus years, and it was a constructive relationship for a very long time, but it ended abruptly, to put it mildly. At a point in time in my life where, my capacity to do things was challenged for personal reasons. Let's leave it at that.
Sure.
Then, it also allowed me the ability to really, truly step away and just reflect during a time like COVID. From October onwards, I was forced to literally just sit in my own mind for months.
Yeah, October 2020.
And I realized the end of 2020. So from October to about January, and did lots of introspection, asked many difficult questions of myself. But then I got, eventually I realized that, listen, I need to find a way to stand up again. I need to find a way to find myself.
Yeah.
And I felt that I had a responsibility to my country to be better. Okay. And I've often had this view that our industry has the ability to change our country and the world, not just our country, the world forever. Okay. And we can still make money, still pay our investors. I'm not doing philanthropy here. Okay. We can change this world, and yet we choose not to.
Okay.
Sometimes to our own personal detriment. I'm talking making money. We will make less money in this strategy. Plus, we hurt our customer. Now, I don't understand that. I don't understand that rationale. Like, why, if we can actually help the country and make more money and give our client a better return, why not do that? Why did we just want to make money ourselves? And I find that fascinating. So, and that's where responsible capital was actually born, was to say, listen here, because of my diverse experience base, going from, a call center agent in theory, because I actually did some call center work at Momentum too, because I had the gift of the gab. I could speak English and Afrikaans well. So it allowed some of the Afrikaans guys that couldn't speak English to the customers, like, Tiaan, you need to come speak English to this guy because he's speaking foreign to me, And so I had lots of broad experience, going from that call center agency all the way up to actually managing money, and having this privilege of having engaged with some of the most intellectually stimulating investment minds in my career. I mean, talking globally, I even had the privilege of meeting Alan Gray, So I've really spent some time with some really interesting guys, And I think for me, what I realized that I want to share that. I want to give back. And I remember having a conversation with my wife, and one of the first things I said to her is, I've got this idea that I think I can restructure the funding structure at ESCOM. And she said to me, and I actually believe I can. So what's fascinating is I ended up emailing Khalid Kasim, which is the CFO of ESCOM. And I said to him, I know this sounds ridiculous, and I'm actually not kidding. I am an investment professional stuff. I think I've got a way to restructure your balance sheet. And I got this email back saying, dude, this sounds a bit too good to be true, but I'll give you my number of my treasurer. And he actually passed me on to his treasurer. Unfortunately, I knew that was the wrong strategy. But anyway, and that's the birth of responsible capital, And I realized that I need to engage with people to act as a soundboard to help them be more creative in what they want to achieve. Okay. Because what I've recognized is, so to put it, responsible capital is not an FSP2. The idea is for the responsible capital is not to run money. Okay. Responsible capital provides a support function to a broad range of customers, including FSP2s, but also FSP1s. Where we provide services to them to assist them in making better decisions in their business. Okay. That includes, how do I market my financial planning skills to my customer? I want to get involved in that. And because I worked with that for 20 years within a financial planning business, I have lots of experience and insight on that I want to share with people. Similarly, if you're an investment manager, one of your biggest challenges, COVID was a good example. I had a lot of investment managers, friends, people that I invested with, some guys that I've never invested with, actually contact me and say, listen, what's your view of this? How are you seeing this? Because shit's crazy. What's your view? Because the other thing I did was I also tried to put it into technology. So I ended up building a valuation model that allowed me to analyze assets and strategies, in rands and in dollars, my two major currencies, that I used as a bit of a, let's call it, magnetic north, true north. So I used it almost as my true north navigator, and to give me an indication of, what are the numbers? So what's the objective side telling me? I know what my emotions are telling me. I know what the media is telling me. And we know those things tend not to have good outcomes. So how do I now get an objective view of what's happening? So it was a risk management strategy. And so I started engaging with a lot of the managers with their own personal doubts that they were sitting with. So I then can act as a soundboard to them. So that's, if you talk the two extremes, I literally also, recently I moved to the rural Eastern Cape last year. So I live in the middle of nowhere. Although I do travel to Gauteng, where I actually am.
In Cape Town.
Yeah. So what's interesting is, when we arrived in the rural Eastern Cape, there's no one there. I remember one of the farmers approached me the other day and she said, listen here, I've got this problem. I don't like my advisor. I'm like, why is that? She's like, no, he's English. I'm like, that's a problem. And so, she says, and she's got this other guy, he's in Bloemfontein, but she doesn't like him because he doesn't know what he's doing. I'm like, okay, she don't want to go to the English guy, but the Afrikaans guy at least doesn't know what he's doing. So how do we balance this risk? And I think that again highlighted to me, there is a need even at the client level. And this is why we're having a conversation, because I'm saying if there's some way that we can help clients just ask better questions, I think it's already a big plus. And technology is allowing us to do that. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, so you're an FSP1, though, because you have to sometimes advise.
So actually, so the interesting thing is I would only advise, I don't have to be, I'm a PTY limited, because I only work with FSP1s. So my aim would normally be is to only work with FSP1. So with this conversation with this farmer, I basically said, listen here, I would have to engage with your advisor or introduce you to a new advisor, because that's my preferred route. I would always want to deal with a regulated entity that assumes the responsibility with the customer. But then that allows me to be a bit much more broader in my, because I'm not in competition with anyone. Does that make sense? That's really my aim.
Makes sense, because the threat is gone.
I want to support the whole ecosystem.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's cool. Okay. And how's it going so far?
I'll be honest.
The industry might not appreciate that input.
Trust me, they don't.
Yeah.
But what is interesting, though, I mean, and again, there's lots of personalities involved here.
Mm.
I think what we do find is, authenticity resonates with people.
Does.
And the longer we present that message that we can have authentic engagement and
Mm.
still have intellectual sound engagement, because that's what
Mm.
people don't think it's possible. They think
Yeah.
they need to have personas in work and personas at home. I tried
Yeah.
that. I tried that for almost
No,
25
no.
years,
Be yourself.
not being my authentic self. And
Yeah. Of
it was soul destroying. It
course.
almost, the unintended consequences in my life was too significant.
It's
Okay.
significant.
And
Yeah.
because of that, I had to make a change.
Of
It
course.
wasn't something that I could just do. I was forced into it. And
Yeah.
I think the more that happens, the more people also realize that, listen here, we can be authentic and show compassion to each other. And
Mm.
that's what makes me, it's been, as I said, over 2 years now, and it's been difficult, to be honest. But I've also had some amazing engagement with people. Okay.
Mm.
I've asked some really interesting questions of myself, and I've come up with some really interesting solutions. And that to
Yeah.
me is exciting. So, I think it's, and I still, as I said, my relationship rests with these FSPs, be it one or
Mm.
twos, and
Mm.
I try and, find ways to serve them effectively. And
Okay.
we deal with a very diverse group of customers, which is also quite interesting. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I always, one of the things I've sort of realized at the moment through various ways is that what you said is you go through difficult times. You're forced to do something, but what did you get instead? What you got instead is you realigned your thinking, you used all the skills that you've got, which are amazing, and you put something together that you feel is your authentic self, and you're not trying to make that work for yourself in the next whatever, how many years you want to
no.
do this.
Well,
So at difficult times, it's hard, it's fucked up, it's while you're in it, you're like, but what did you get instead? And you've gotten
yeah,
something different instead. It still uses the skills that you've got because we have all this experience, and we're that we've gained, and we just need to then package it in this difficult time, and find out what it is we want to do and what we're passionate about and what's our purpose.
yeah,
I think you're similar age to me. You're like 44, 45, or
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Born in
yeah. I mean,
'78.
our pie chart is halfway full, basically, depending on the mortality rate. We must talk
Exactly.
about it, but
I
we've
think
got half.
I'm a third in now. I'm a third in. I'm a healthy man these
Okay,
days.
you're gonna live long. Okay, so I
Yes.
feel I'm halfway. I've only got half my pie chart left. It's the time to do. This didn't work, or it worked, but I got other things instead. What's my second half of my pie chart looking like? And that's really great.
I think and again, something like COVID also brought that home quickly. It's
Of
like,
course,
I think
it's a
people
good test.
realize, you got to ask yourself the question, is this really what I want to do? And I've always known it's not what I want to do. I've always, I
Okay.
remember someone asked me as a youngin, I was like in my early, late 20s. Someone asked me, what would you want to do? I said, no, I want to change the world, you know.
Mm.
And someone said to me, how are you going to do it? I said, well, I honestly believe, and I said to him, well, we must use financial assets more effectively.
Right.
And he said to me, what do you mean? I'm saying, well, there's more than enough financial assets in the world. We just apply them incorrectly. How is that
Right.
possible? And South Africa is one of the greatest examples of that.
Mm.
And again, the other day I was in a podcast and someone called me die sonskyn econoom because I was actually on the podcast with the guy that's known as the sonskyn econoom, a guy called Roelof Botha. And I just, Roelof's an awesome guy. And it was interesting because we share so many views, but he comes from an economics background. And I don't.
Yeah.
So I come from an investment background. I look at the world from a very different perspective. But it was interesting to see the overlap. But someone called me a sonskyn econoom. And I thought to myself, I don't base my views on my emotive state because trust me, that would have been quite dangerous at times, especially during COVID, for instance. You have to have a more sound rationale for making a decision than it feels good, or it feels like the right thing to do. Interestingly enough, I would probably say more than 50% of people let their feelings run wild, and that probably, again, is reflected in the the numbers. If you look at investment performance, let's use that as an example. You mentioned that earlier with your friend. Investment performance is quite a complex scenario. So there's a lot of biases entrenched in the data that we need to compensate for that most people don't. But let's assume the data is fine. I think depending on whose data you use, sometimes the data is better. But what I find interesting is almost 50% of managers tend to underperform their benchmark, over time. And then you have like a couple of really highly skilled guys that tend to outperform, and then there's the average that does okay. But in general, net, because of emotions, customers tend to do far worse than the average, okay? And it's got nothing to do with the quality of the investment outcomes that are available. It relates to the emotional reasons why people make certain decisions. So literally, like right now is a great example, doldrums of despair on South Africa, the rand's blowing out for shit, and everyone's telling you, no, it's the Russian deal, okay? And that is the emotive narrative. I was with one of my best, basically like my brother, the other day, and we had a conversation just about emotions. And he works for one of the, and he's a doctor in he's a highly intelligent specialist guy in investments. And he was saying to me, yeah, but the ANC is so terrible, and look at what they're doing. And I said to him, yes, you're right, they are terrible. But what we've got to recognize, most governments in the world are inept. It's not a South African phenomenon, The benchmark in terms of what makes your government poor and good is probably a little bit different. But most citizens of the world, I was reading in our conversation, that's the benefit of technology. And LinkedIn, social media to me was a bit of I didn't really enjoy it. So when I initially started my LinkedIn journey, it was challenging for me. And then I started engaging with some really interesting people, and I had this nuclear physicist that I could contact in Germany, or I had a guy that I could contact in Canada and have a conversation with. And it was fascinating. I started getting some really interesting information. Yeah. And these guys, what I found interesting about the Canadian people, depending on which spectrum, it's like the Democrats and the Republicans in the US. The Republicans absolutely despise Biden. 70% think he's absolutely senile and useless. And the Democrats are telling you the whole time he's the most loved president of all time. He's like JFK on steroids. Average Joe loves Joe. Like, how is that? And then you look at the country and you look at the numbers and you look at the survey numbers. And we often place credence in survey numbers in our industry. Like, oh, look at what the Purchasers Managers Index is telling us, and look at what this. And then you look at the bias entrenched in those surveys, and you say, well, hang on. So how is it possible the one American, which is Republican, thinks his country's gone to shit and everything sucks and the whole economy is murtu and nothing is working, and the Democrat that lives off grants tells you, listen, the country is awesome and our president's amazing, okay? There is some that, I'm not saying either of them are right.
Sure.
The answer is that it's probably somewhere in between. And that's the scenario here too. In South Africa, as much as we have challenges, we also have positives. And right now, most people are missing the positives. They're just highlighting the negatives. Now, it doesn't denounce the negatives, but currently we literally, we're losing perspective. And, my favorite band in the world is Fok of Politica. And as I said, I'm not just a South African rock fan. I'm a love music. And out of my top 10 albums of all time, 2 are Fok of Politica albums. So that gives you an indication. And, it includes all the Beatles and other. So I'm a big fan. And one of my favorite quotes from them is, "Perspectief is nie 'n speelding." And that's so important. And our industry messes with it like it's a toy the whole time. We're taking people from this side of the equation to that side of the equation without empirical data and just exploiting emotions. You know why? Because we make more money that way. Someone trades his shares and then sells it to the life insurance company at a discount, and they make money off it. That's pervasive, man. So we're using people's ignorance.
You said we're using the other way. Follow the money. Tiaan, okay, there was 2 other things I think I wanted to just ask you about, which we said we would talk about. I don't want to talk about them too long because I think the conversation did also take a little bit of a different turn, but it's great. Because of your LinkedIn journey, And because of your views on South Africa, I think, and being positive about South Africa, not because it's just great, it's just because people aren't seeing the positives and they're ignoring it.
Yeah.
You started some kind of competition with Magnus Heystek, who is very anti-South Africa, very, pro take your money out of the country, that the rand is going to shit. Give me a little bit of a quick summary of that competition and where it's at, because I think maybe we have another conversation about it, like just on that. But just give me a little quick idea.
Okay, so actually, where it came from, it's not a competition I started with Magnus. What actually happened was they were at a conference. I presume it was a Biz News conference that Alec Hogg hosted. And at the conference, a client basically put the challenge forward to two of the major voices at this conference. The one voice was Magnus Heystek, and the other voice in the discussion was a guy called Piet Viljoen. Piet Viljoen would be deep value. Let's call it that. Okay, so and Piet runs a fund, and he's run that strategy for many years. He's run that same strategy in different guises, I think, for more than 25 years. And I've followed him for close to 25 years, okay, in terms of what he does. Okay. And I've got, Piet's not necessarily everyone's cup of tea, and he's very comfortable with that. But I've always had a unique respect for his views. And also, ex-Alan Gray man. I think he left Alan Gray in 94 to join Investec. So investment thinking. He set up his own business eventually, and eventually, it got swallowed into a bigger business. The boutique model isn't easy. Piet was a prime example of that. But still, he doesn't struggle, so he's fine. And he has the ability to think clearly about stuff. But what's fascinating, so at this conference, you can think 2021, COVID, the world's still in chaos. No one's sure how this is going to end. The vibe on tech is the only thing that's going to save us was really big. South Africa had actually done quite well through COVID. We've recovered quite well, and there was a lot of positives happening, and Piet was saying that. And Magnus was basically just saying, listen here, all bullshit and lies. This thing's going to shit. The ANC's in control. This thing's screwed. And interestingly enough, so this client or this participant at the event then put the challenge forward to them to say, listen here, if I gave you 500,000 Rand each, what will you do with the money?
Okay.
Now, today. And what we'll do is we'll put this in, and whoever wins in the end wins, and he can put the money to a charity or something. I think that's the gist of the scenario. Right. I wasn't at the event. So what actually happened was I read an article about this in November 2021 that was published on, I think, one of the publications that picked up on this challenge. Okay. So all I started doing, probably 5 months in, is just do an analysis of how is it going. So, and all I did was I just said, listen here, I'm biased. I'm telling you straight up, I think Piet is right. Okay. The reason I think he's right is it's valuation and timing. So it's a structural, cyclical driver. It's got nothing to do with skills. I know Piet, I'm a big fan, but that's not the reason I'm picking his strategy. I'm picking his strategy based on where we are in the cycle. Okay. And I basically just started keeping score. That's all I did. Okay. And every month I would do a little update on it. And, I would keep score and just say, listen, so here's the difference between the two strategies, and that's it. And eventually, I always try to reach out to both parties to try for them to, do their thing. It's only on Twitter. He's not on LinkedIn, I think. So I can't do Twitter, I can't remember my passwords. I can't get in. Sorry, Elon, you got to sort me out.
I can repost your stuff on Twitter if you want. We can do the Twitter thing.
Please do. Go ahead. It'll be awesome. But what's interesting is, so eventually one day I get this snotty reply on my post. And I'm like, I've tried to reach out to you more than once. I've sent you messages because I actually know his, so I know his bigger business, Brentest Wealth. I know some parties related, and they speak highly of the man. So I'm not, and as I said, he has, fact, there's more followers than me on LinkedIn and Twitter. So obviously there's people that he resonates with. As I said, when someone calls me a lapkop or something on his Twitter feed, I'm like, that's a little bit extreme. But anyway, someone said I'm a disgrace to my kind. What kind is that? Tall people. Tall people. So people with their glasses. I don't know which kind of people. Perhaps it's the Fouries because we're quite a big family. I don't know. it probably highlights a certain segment that he speaks with. But the bottom line for me is, I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. And that's why I'm just keeping score, because for me, it's an accountability thing.
Exactly.
I struggle when people make statements in the general populace and they are not held accountable for it. And that includes specifically economists and asset managers. I mean, I had a scenario the other day, well, not the other day, recently, with one of the largest companies in our country laying claim to, expected violence, that, you remember the shit that we went through in July 2021, it's coming again. We're going to have our Arab Spring. And they used the baseline, and someone else did it recently, where it relates to food insecurity. Because people were talking about food insecurity during COVID. It was a big hoo-ha. And I was like, what the hell are you guys talking about? And this is a credible, one of, as I say, top 5 investment institutions in our country, okay, with massive market penetration. And it's one of their top asset managers, like a best of breed organization. They made these claims about how South Africa is possibly, there's a possibility that we could experience an Arab Spring because of food shortages. I was like, listen here, those claims are complete bogus, because the empirical data shows you that we are having bumper harvests because of La Nina. So food security is our last worry on the equation. Okay, It's not food security that's going to drive an upheaval. It's something different. And it's just, so those are the kind of narratives that I think we need to present in the market. And fortunately, we now have social media that allows for it. The one negative is obviously, when Magnus posts an article, because what was interesting is I did an update on Magnus's thing just about, I want to say April. And again, this was now pre the recent rally, but by the time the rally had occurred, I think tech was up like something 50% of its lows. Okay. And in spite of that 50% bounce, the strategy that Magnus selected was still more than 25 or something percent behind pitch strategy. Okay.
Yeah.
And he presented a new post. Okay. Calling me out and saying, oh, he didn't call me out. He just, he didn't mention my name. He says there is a certain market commentator, laying claim that, my strategy is fucked and whatever. And it's turned out that the strategy is backed. It's now ahead of pitch strategy. Okay. And I looked at this analysis. I'm like, dude, I did an update 2 weeks ago. I know you're not close. I know there's some bounce. But so it turned out that he'd taken a new fund that does something similar to the fund that he originally selected. Okay, but that fund has done exceptionally well the last 3 months. And it actually had outperformed his fund by almost 20% over that 3-month period. Okay, right. And he used that in his comparison, not the actual fund he selected in 2021. So I just reminded him of those facts again. But he doesn't want to. Now, the challenge is, so when Magnus shares a post, he gets 20,000 views. When I share a post, some of my posts, I've been quite impressed. Thanks to Magnus, has reached more members. But, that reply that I shared on his post, only garnered something like 1,000 views. Okay. And I think the people that looked at it probably already knew it. So it didn't have the penetration that it should have had. Because now many of his followers believe Magnus is ahead. Okay. And he's still 25% behind. And this is where, we need to get that message out. Now, Magnus is only an expression of the industry symptom that we face, because there's other people like Magnus. One of the key things for me that I really struggle with these days is misrepresentation of data, from the large houses or the people that have gravitas, and and I try and engage the people, and I struggle. And one of the, industries that really concern me that is applying that strategy is the alternative investment industry. The hedge fund industry is not doing itself favors because they're acting in a manner that does not serve their customer. And we're only going to find that out in 10 years' time. And this is the challenge.
Yeah. So the other question I think I wanted to ask you, it's a little bit off center maybe, but it obviously involves maybe what people are talking about because of the rand and the dollar being, the world reserve currency and things such as that. Is what would be your take on Bitcoin? Do you know anything about it? What's your view?
So, off the bat, I can tell you, I would consider myself an absolute crypto nerd in many ways. Okay, in terms of that, I did an extreme amount of work on crypto in 2013. So many years ago, 10 years ago.
That's early days.
And the reason was,
That was basically just Bitcoin because Ethereum came out in
Yeah.
20.
So it was, and it
Yeah.
was it was even prior to the hard fork. So this was
Okay.
BSV we're talking about. So it was, well, actually it was
Oh
both.
yes, yes, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so but the reason I was interested in it was purely as a tail hedge risk. Okay, so it's not that that was my initial thinking. I was looking at this as optionality. Okay, so from a pure investment perspective, because the
Yeah.
price had gone from fractions of a cent to at that stage $50 a Bitcoin,
Wow.
$50. Okay,
Yeah.
and I started I started engaging with our regulator on it because I was keen to allocate a component in our offshore funds to Bitcoin,
Yeah.
and they
How
said
much
I was
percent?
ludicrous.
How much percent?
0.5. I thought 0.5
Yeah.
was reasonable. And the only reason I picked 0.5 was I ended up buying options for that exact amount. So I ended
Okay.
up investing in, so I was looking at this as optionality relative to an unexpected event. That's what I was, so it was a pure investment conversation initially.
Okay.
That's where it started. And the return profile was completely asymmetric. It looked insane. And
Yeah.
the regulator told me I am insane. I'm not allowed to buy it. So I'm like, okay, cool.
Which
I let it
regulator?
go. The regulator of our funds in Guernsey. So, I mean, this is now, I'm
Oh,
talking international regulator. So I was looking to bring it into our regulated fund schemes. Does that make sense? And they said,
yes.
there's no way you can do that. Okay. So I'm like, okay, cool. And I basically let it go, but I kept on keeping track of the price, And then I discovered some interest from clients and I did lots of reading on it because I was always interested. And this led me down the path of actually exploring the white paper and going into, it's 9 pages, man. It's not a lot of reading, You don't require a degree in forensic accounting to do it. I could relate to the guy with a degree in forensic accounting because I've done some work on that. So I've got some insight into it. And that was interesting to me, When I started reading the narrative around, what Bitcoin is, because the narrative that's being presented in the community today is Bitcoin is this, anonymous, alternative, decentralized, server of the man, or sorry, against the man, server of the people. It's going to bring us freedom. That's a lie. It's not. That's not.
Why
That's
do you
not what
think
it is. Because the code doesn't tell you that. So Bitcoin originally was supposed to be a centralized system. Okay? It would have developed into a centralized system because that the infrastructure requirement to run big streams of Bitcoin to make it as a transactable scenario would require centralization. But that would keep everyone honest. And as a forensic accountant, now this is now depending on which narrative you embrace. I've had the privilege to engage with some people very close, directly involved with someone like Craig Wright, on this scenario of the Bitcoin BSV BTC split, and the fork that occurred around it. And I would say to you, I think there is a possibility that BTC is not around in 10 years' time. Okay. And that's an interesting statement. I think BSV could be. So now I can recognize I unequivocally recognize my bias. Okay. But again, so for me, it's the code thing. What bothers me, as I said, the narrative that's being presented on Bitcoin bothers me. The fact that the ownership is so concentrated in Bitcoin bothers me. Okay. And it doesn't, again, it's like from an investment perspective, the fact that the wealth of the world is controlled by a few hands is a problem to me. Okay. If Bitcoin had to become the reserve currency or some kind of backup to that, the dominant players in Bitcoin, there's a couple of them. I'm not much less than 0.1% that the world's estimated controls the world. In Bitcoin, you're talking about like 20 people. It's like a fraction of a fraction controls the bulk of the supply. That's an issue, especially if they stick to the hard cap. Now, this is the challenge. BSV, the actual programming doesn't allow for a shift away from that. We've already seen more than one hard fork because of the community-based approach in BTC. And that's part of the design. Okay. They're saying that the community can only go as far. Now, I must say, so I had the privilege of, so I would consider myself a complete uninformed individual on crypto. So I don't see myself as a professional or a specialist at all. I can also tell you, I've probably spent more than 2,500 hours researching Bitcoin. Okay. So what I find fascinating, I find someone contact me via LinkedIn calling himself a Bitcoin specialist, and then he's been doing it for 18 months. And I'm like, cool, dude. Thanks for sharing the info. You're a day trader trying to make a buck. And sometimes some of them are really good looking, so it's still worthwhile to have the engagement at least. It's interesting. It's probably I think it's a modeling strategy because
willing to have it.
They sometimes do modeling too, so it's like really interesting to me. So I find that because I would consider myself a reasonable specialist in financial solutions. But I wouldn't consider myself a Bitcoin specialist. Even though, as I said, I've probably spent more time than most Bitcoin specialists on it. And it's because I've had the privilege to deal with Bitcoin specialists, people that actually do this for a living, And I've got to give a shout to the guy called Lorian Gamarov. If you want to know something about Bitcoin, that's the guy to talk to. The challenge is he's very non-PC for the crypto community because he basically calls most of them out to be thieves, And
but
he doesn't.
But just quickly, my understanding is, and it's not necessarily my view, but there's this debate around Bitcoin is not a crypto. The rest of the crypto industry are shit coins. That's a view that some share.
The official name,
So some like to very much distinguish between Bitcoin and crypto, but I don't know. I don't know what your take on that.
This is, I think 100% correct. I mean, the regulation in crypto is a problem. So that means why is there 14,000 cryptos? It's not because it's going to serve the customers. Trust me, it's not. Someone's making a buck here. That's why there's 14,000 cryptos. And it's going to continue because and it's regardless of regulation. People always think regulation is the answer. Regulation is not the answer. Ponzi schemes still exist. I mean, we had one the other day. There's Ponzi schemes in crypto, but it's just easy to do it there. There's Ponzi schemes going on. There's Ponzi schemes going on in Centurion right now, so there's lots of, and then people call it, the mandala flower vibes. That's just fucking another version of I'm going to steal your money, and people fall for it,
Sure.
And I'm not talking Herbalife and Tupperware vibes, but, it's similar, So the bottom line here is, the probability that we're going to, how many currencies do we have in the world today? So something like 220 currencies in the world. How can there be 14,000 crypto? It makes no sense. So if you had to ask me, as I said, will the technology around crypto, like Bitcoin is a great example, blockchain's already had an impact on the world. It will always have an impact on the world. Will it improve the world? I think so. I think Ethereum is interesting. I think self-executing contracts gets rid of lawyers. I think that's a good thing. Gets rid of accountants. I think that's a good thing in most cases. Because accountants and lawyers, I will put myself in, let's call it the accounting bracket. We have found ways to make shit complicated to support us, not the customer. Okay. And I think technology can help that, and that's where I'm excited. But if you say to me, should I invest in crypto? I'm saying, first of all, you're not investing in crypto. Okay. You're not. If you want to play in crypto and make money in crypto, that's all possible, but don't call it investing. It's something different. Okay. It's speculation to the nth degree. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's, as I said, is almost go against the flow. I always say to people, the day you want to get involved in Bitcoin is after something has happened, where there's either been like a complete implosion and people tell you it won't exist. That's the time. Okay. I don't think we're there yet. Now, I'll be honest, you look at something like BSV is probably in that space. And the reason it's there is, the dominant narrative in Bitcoin is BSV is a farce. They've entrenched that narrative well on the chat rooms and, highly credible guys saying, I'm saying to you, question that narrative and chat to a guy like Lorian Gamarov. He'd be a good guy to engage here. He's got a company called Saint B. I don't know if you know Lorian. If you don't, get in touch with him. He's an awesome guy. And really, really solid individual. So, I still believe there is a role to play. But, tying it to something like the reserve currency, no, don't. It's not. Bitcoin is interesting. And,
in terms of,
but there is a narrative in the Bitcoin community that they're trying to position it as that, saying Bitcoin could be the reserve currency. It can't. The probability that the US dollar will be challenged as a reserve currency attracts a lot of attention. You know why? Because it's an interesting narrative. The probability of that happening in our lifetimes including my expected 150 years, I'm telling you now, is extremely low. I'm talking less than 2%, like really low. And the reason for it is not that it shouldn't happen. The incentive to do it just is too low.
Right.
So,
and tell me, what do you think about Bitcoin being a means of payment for just general things? Like being able to use it as a payment mechanism.
Yes, I think this is the challenge that you face because the volatility in its valuation. It doesn't really. There's some critical factors or characteristics that you need to be an effective method of exchange. Okay, price stability is one. Okay, so now people think, Bitcoin is really stable if you price it in gold. It's a rumor, man. You can't use it for transactional capability. But this is the interesting thing. So when you look at it, can be a reference asset, okay, to transact. Yes. Okay. So what you will do is, regardless of how the price fluctuates, the price of the thing that you buy won't be priced in Bitcoin. It's priced in rands or dollars or whatever it is. And you walk in there and you can pay based on the valuation of your Bitcoin, you can pay. Yeah. So there is, and this is what's interesting. And that's what I find interesting about someone like Lorian, because that's his focus is, how do I make transacting cheaper for the end customer? That's their goal. Yeah. Okay. How do I, do remittance of money more effectively, that it's not as similar? Because Bitcoin was originally set up as a remittance option, saying, we can do remittance of people's bringing back money from South Africa to Zimbabwe. Right. And we don't have to charge 25% like money charge or whoever the guys are, low margin business that day, like a loan sharking. But anyway, the point is, these guys come up in scenarios where Bitcoin should have taken that market. Definitely. It didn't. You know why? Because people couldn't pay with Bitcoin. So it didn't work.
But the Lightning network allows for that now. Do you know much about that?
It's starting to shift. Yeah. So, but and what I wanted to say around that is what Lorian's done in his business, and that's why I think it's really interesting chat for you to have that. Because as I said, I would consider myself a bit of a Luddite, and I'm not technologically inclined. Lorian lives that, that's his life. So he set up a business, Cent B, which is actually almost the go-between, and that would fulfill something similar to the Lightning network. But it actually, I think it's much more. It has broader application, and I think. So he's recently secured some funding from some, I think, Dutch-based or offshore-based guy. So I think he's really at the point of now leveraging his app a little bit. So he could be a fascinating guy to talk about that. Yeah. From my perspective, as I said to you, I enjoy the technological applications. So
yeah. So I think that it is early days, and the way to make payments simple, and like you said, the customer's only paying in rand or dollars. They're buying whatever they want to buy. They need to pay that. They need to pay low fees. If in the back end that is being done by Bitcoin, it shouldn't affect them as much, and that's starting to happen. But it's still early days, and it needs to be tested, obviously, definitely. So yeah. Okay, so I think I've got your take on that. It's good, thank you. I think I didn't really want to ask you another question because we actually talked about beach bats, which is basketball, which is also my game already. Do you still play basketball?
I'll be honest, I probably haven't played basketball more than 20 years. Okay.
Really?
I actually went, so I haven't played in many, many decades, which is quite sad. But it's just, I'll be honest, I've also went through a bit of a transformation physically. So I went from being basketball fit to being, a sumo wrestler fit in the space of about 10 years. And and it was the good old days of the financial services lifestyle that definitely helped.
Evidence for free,
the excesses,
the booze.
Yes, I remember at one stage the only place I could weigh myself was at the airport, because even the scale at the gym didn't work anymore. It's at like 180 limit. And I remember when I get at the airport, I'd fly and I'm weigh. And the last time I weighed myself was on the way to Hong Kong, and we were going through the sevens, nice and subtle. And a group of 40 hooligans just going, and I weighed in and I was 206 kilograms. So I was 209.
You are 209.
And I weighed 206 kilograms, and that was my peak, as I call it. And Well, I probably say the bottom line was later that year I started to explore a different approach to life, which was I was about to turn 30, and I realized, yes, perhaps my lifestyle is a little bit extreme, and you know, it taught me a lot about myself. But the bottom line was, I started recognizing that I need to take care of myself better. Unfortunately, it didn't include playing basketball, but yeah. So I was a keen golfer. That's also, gone by the by a bit.
And what do you
Dedicate that
now?
kind of time is difficult. So I actually, so I tend not to do too much. When on the farm, you do lots of physical exertion, like hiking and chopping wood and doing all kinds of crazy things. But during COVID, I actually started embracing extreme cold therapy.
Okay.
Where I actually get in cold water. And, so a lot of people do the Wim Hof vibe and, try and do the cold shower for a couple of seconds. I took that to a slightly more extreme sport. And
As you would, Tiaan, as you would.
yeah, so, as I said, moderation is my middle name, and I don't have one. So so that's it was fascinating. And I'll be honest, it definitely changed my life. It's allowed me to address certain aspects that has been very positive. I've now lost, in 2020. The other thing is I stopped eating meat, so I became a vegetarian in 2020. I went to up the creek. I don't know if you've ever been there. I mean, I see they've put out.
I know. I've never been, I think I never heard about it. My aunt and uncle used to. That's like in the Drakensberg, right?
No, that's Splashy Fen. Up
Up
the
the
creek is actually in Swellendam, so it's on the
Oh,
river.
okay. Sorry,
Yeah. So you must go. They've opened tickets for next year. I think it's one of the best festivals I've been in my life. And I used to be a big Oppie fan. I don't know.
Oppie was the best.
Yeah, so I probably did. I was more than 20 times on that farm. Lost lots of self-respect and lots of scars on that copia. But anyway, lots of good times too. I actually asked. I got engaged to my wife at Oppie on stage. Wow. I proposed after Fok of Polisie played. I proposed in front of 17,000 people.
Oh my word! Your favorite band.
Yeah. Unfortunately, so it was a funny story. Franny actually initially. Hunter's a good mate. So, well, I mean, I know all the guys well, but Hunter is, my mate. So, and I remember phoning Hunter to say, dude, I want to do this. And Hunter's like, I'll speak to Franny. We'll do it in the middle of the set. And then you can come in. Franny was like, fuck that. We're not doing it in the middle of the set. What if she says no? Like a total. So, and he was right. She could have said no. He knew me well. So he had baseline for that. Especially having met my wife. He's like, how did this happen? But fortunately, she didn't say no. And, it's so I've always had a fun place. But up the creek, I went there in 2020. Literally, it was the last festival we went to in February 2020. And I decided to become vegetarian. Okay. I said, I'll give it 12 months and I'll be vegetarian. And in the process, I ended up losing about 60 kilograms again. So I peaked at 206, lost like 70, picked up 50. And then I was like, well, let's call it 175 in February 2020. So, big frame, I can carry it. But interesting enough, I'm now down to about 115, so having giving up meat. But it's probably not just that. It's more complex. But so I'm fighting fit. I'm probably the best shape I've been in a very, very long time, more than 20 years. So the other day I went to bounce with my daughter. Yes. I'm going on Monday again.
You jump with the trampoline stuff.
Crazy, man. And that's when I realized I tried to dunk the ball. I could dunk the ball from the ground, and I have this like slam dunk vibe. There you jump on the trampoline. I can't do it, man. I can't get there anymore. So obviously I've got some hard work to do. And interestingly enough, there's another guy in our industry. They actually have a league up in Joburg where they try and play once or twice a month, I think. And they play at Wembley and they do. So I'm actually considering doing that again. But I know I've got to get a bit more fit before I do that. So yeah, perhaps
I want to definitely play with you. I've gotten back into it because my son's really into it. There's some sports around here. So yeah, if we must play 1-on-1.
Awesome, man.
Definitely keen on that, man. I mean, I want to see you because you must be fucking way taller than me. So, yeah. I mean, I'm one. I'm like 6'2", 188. So yeah.
No, I mean, so my 13-year-old is 188. So he's about your and
my 16-year-old's 191 now, so he's getting there. So he'll be taller. Yeah.
Okay, so he's taller than you already. Yeah, that's it's. But I'll definitely take you up on that offer if you know where a couple of courses. I saw there. My family lives in Hout Bay, so I do come there quite regularly. And my son actually lives in Strand. I mean, as I told you, so he goes to school in Stellenbosch.
Okay, so we got a basketball game going. 100%.
He plays chess though. I mean, he's not a big basketball fan.
Well, at least the one-on-one with us. At least
exactly, we can do the one-on-one.
Okay, cool. Listen,
awesome.
Tiaan, it's been really good talking to you. I think there's also some definite future podcasts that we need to maybe do as this progresses. But thanks for your time, and I'm looking forward to meeting you and playing a game of ball.
Yeah, listen, where are you based?
Cape Town.
Suburbs. But southern suburbs or where?
No, just right here, like Town, Greenpoint area.
Okay. Okay, cool. No, listen, that'll be awesome. I'll let you know when I'm down there. I was considering a trip in probably September. So if I do, if it works out, I'll let you know. Be awesome to
bring
catch
me
up.
a birthday present. It's my birthday in September.
Is that so? What day?
15th.
Exactly. Well, I'll get you some nice, some good old herb.
Okay, lekker, man. Cool.
Awesome. Cool stuff.
Okay. Good, buddy.
Cheers, dude. Enjoy.
Yeah. Cool. Bye. Bye.